Hey everyone, this is Pete. I finished Final Fantasy Adventure, and I want to talk about it. Technically, I finished Mystic Quest, which is what the game was called in Europe. It was known as Final Fantasy Adventure in North America, and Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden in Japan. It's also become known in more recent years, thanks to two completely separate remakes, as both Sword of Mana and Adventures of Mana, making it possibly the one single game with the most correct names for it. A lot of people have assumed over the years that this game, which we'll refer to as Final Fantasy Adventure for the sake of convenience from here on, was only branded with Final Fantasy as a marketing move for the North American market. But, as you may have spotted from the Japanese title, although Seiken Densetsu, the series we came to know in the West as Mana, became its own distinct thing, this first installment was very much considered a Final Fantasy spin-off or Gaiden title. For the curious, the three games named Final Fantasy Legend in North America were in fact only given the Final Fantasy branding for marketing purposes, since they're actually some of the first entries in the Saga series. But then Saga can be argued to be a spin-off of Final Fantasy II anyway, and that's a whole other discussion we'll probably have to have another day. So for now, I digress. In Final Fantasy Adventure, you take on the role of a young man who is enslaved as a gladiator. After watching your Willy perish before your very eyes, you resolve to escape your captivity, a surprisingly straightforward process, and discover the truth behind the power of mana that the evil Dark Lord and his lackey Julius are searching for. Along the way you encounter a girl, whom you can also name along with your main character, who likewise has suffered the loss of a friend. Conveniently discovering that she may in fact be key to this whole mana business, you team up with her and decide to seek out the last of the Gemma Knights, erstwhile protectors of the Tree of Mana, and so begins a grand adventure. And it is a surprisingly grand one. Considering this game was first released in 1991 on Game Boy, this is an impressively large action RPG with an open structure overworld that features an impressive amount of scope. Much like the Final Fantasy series that begat it, Final Fantasy Adventure initially takes you on a relatively linear path from point to point across this world, before providing you with an increasing amount of freedom as you progress. Hopefully by the time you reach this point you'll know your way around pretty well, because the in-game map is almost completely useless. One can draw obvious comparisons between Final Fantasy Adventure and Nintendo's classic The Legend of Zelda series, and indeed there are some superficial similarities. They are, in fact, rather distinct experiences, however. While Zelda, for the most part, makes character progression and game progression one and the same, Final Fantasy Adventure still has some traditional RPG mechanics working beneath the surface. Beating up enemies rewards you with experience points, and with enough experience points you level up. In a nice bit of customizability, you can actually choose which of your 4 stats to prioritise with each level up, allowing you to effectively build your character as you see fit. In practice, having a balanced character is probably the best way to go, since both physical and magic abilities are useful at various points, but there's nothing stopping you seeing if, say, a mage run of the game is a viable option. In true RPG tradition, you'll also gather new equipment as you progress in Final Fantasy Adventure, but herein lies an aspect of the game where it hews closer to Zelda than mainline Final Fantasy. Each weapon has its own distinct attack pattern, and many also have secondary functions. For example, axes can cut down trees, a morning star can smash down walls, a sickle can cut through plants, and whips can be used to swing across gaps if suitable things to hook them onto are available. Not only that, but various enemy types throughout the game are weak or invulnerable to certain types of weapons. So you'll find that as you work your way through Final Fantasy Adventure, you'll be switching weapons a lot, and I mean a lot, to a frankly cumbersome degree at times, though you soon get used to it. Although Final Fantasy Adventure is a real-time action RPG, it's pretty rare you'll find yourself in a position where you don't have time to switch out weapons or magic. The action pauses while you have the menu up for one, and for the most part enemy attack patterns are fairly mindless rather than presenting any sort of sophisticated AI for you to deal with. This goes for the bosses too, and to be honest this is a bit of a weak point of the game that only becomes more apparent as you make progress and become stronger. Early in the game, your character's relatively weak stats and equipment mean that you'll have to actively observe boss attack patterns and strike during suitable openings. But pretty much from the moment you get the Cure spell, which is quite early in the story, most boss fights can be overcome by finding a good place to stand, spamming your attack and just healing yourself if you take too much damage. It's outside of combat where Final Fantasy Adventure shines, since that vast world is interesting to explore with lots to discover. In contrast to Zelda, there aren't many secrets to find, but that's honestly just fine. It means that everything you stumble across has some sort of relevance to the game as a whole, which is satisfying. The dungeons too are enjoyable to explore, gradually escalating in difficulty and complexity as the game progresses. Although composed entirely out of square rooms, the various gimmicks you'll encounter give Final Fantasy Adventure something of a dungeon crawler feel at times, particularly when you come across puzzle sequences. Early in the game these are extremely simple, stand on a switch to make a passageway open, that sort of thing. But later you'll have to make creative use of your magic and the environment in order to progress. There is one thing worth noting for newcomers, however, and that's the fact that it is possible to pretty much get yourself soft-locked on a few occasions in the game, most notably during a fairly late-game dungeon. Door keys are consumable items in Final Fantasy Adventure, you see, and unlike in Zelda, you don't acquire them from specific points in dungeons, you have to buy them from shops. If you run out, your only option is to beat up some skeleton enemies that have a high chance to drop keys, but if you're trapped in an area where those skeleton enemies don't spawn, you're pretty screwed. Best advice to avoid this is to always ensure you have several stacks of keys on you at all times, and to be doubly safe, make sure you save regularly in both of the available save slots, preferably with a safe save outside the dungeon entrance until you've cleared the whole thing. Thankfully, in my own playthrough, I only encountered this issue once, and fortunately I had a save file that didn't set me back too far. But the Glaive Castle dungeon is known among some Final Fantasy Adventure fans as the newbie trap, for good reason. The game's story, although told in the minimalist sort of way you would expect from a 1991 Game Boy title, is effective, featuring some surprisingly emotional moments and an NPC body count that rivals Final Fantasy II. The English translation is phrased a little peculiarly, to say the least, demonstrating a remarkable aversion to definite articles in particular. But before long, Final Fantasy Adventure's oddly stilted means of delivering its narrative to you becomes a charm point rather than a weakness. Notably, the environmental message of the Mana series is present and correct right from the beginning, demonstrating that inherently neutral, natural things can be harnessed for both good and evil, and that taking the latter option pretty much almost always ends up destroying the thing in question. Humans can live in harmony with nature, the game suggests, but it's important to protect nature from those who would do it harm in an attempt to further their own agenda. A message that's even more poignant today than it was back in 1991, I'm sure you'll agree. Final Fantasy Adventure is a great game. It shows its age a bit in its combat mechanics and encounter design, but structurally and mechanically it holds up very well. It's also a fine looking Game Boy game, taking full advantage of the system's limited capabilities to produce something that looks distinctive and recognisably Final Fantasy, as well as featuring a catchy, memorable, dramatic and inspiring soundtrack. While for many people the Mana series really came into its own with its 16-bit second instalment Secret of Mana on Super NES, don't sleep on Final Fantasy Adventure, particularly now it's so easy to access it thanks to the excellent collection of Mana on Nintendo Switch. A perfect modern home for this game if ever there was one.